Exodus chapter 1 is where we'll be looking at some other verses from the book of Genesis as well, transitioning from one book to the other. Exodus chapter 1. All right. Well, a year or so ago, I started researching the history of our family's home. And my research led me on a fascinating journey, not only about our house and our property, but also about our town, Pine Tops. I found a lot of information. I came across the librarian there in Pine Tops gave me a book to borrow, and it was written about the town of Pine Tops. If you have a chance to ever read that, it's just fascinating. A lot of dates, pictures, stories, all kinds of different things there. I even went over to Tarboro and met with a local historian there. She works at the library, and she took me back. I called it the secret room. I don't know what they call it over there, but it was in the very back. They keep it under lock and key. They don't let everybody in there. And I was allowed to sit at one of those tables, and she kept bringing out book after book. I mean, I had a whole stack of books and files and pictures. She pulled up a bunch of stuff on the computer, and she was looking up stuff for me there. I mean, I spent a couple hours there just kind of researching all of that. And then probably the most helpful thing that I did in my research was I interviewed one of my neighbors right across the road. Some of you know this fellow. We call him Mr. Fleet. Norfleet is his name, I think. And but we call him Mr. Fleet. And he's always bringing, matter of fact, he did that this past week. Gave the kids some Eskimo pies. And but anyway, I was able to sit down with him. He is the oldest World War II veteran in our area. And, I mean, he knows just about everything there is about our area. And I sit down with him for probably over an hour in his yard and just ask him question after question after question about different things. And so, and that was fun. And so what I ended up with was a big old stack of documents and photographs and stories from various people about different events, different times. And all of them were basically clues about the past that a lot of people either don't know about or have forgotten about. And it was just one of the neatest things I think I've ever done in researching and putting that together. But I was thinking about that journey this past week, and as I thought about it, I had this thought. What if someone in the distant future, when the day comes that I'm not around and you're not around anymore, somebody in the distant future would look back and they'd start doing some research on our life, your life, my life, trying to figure out who we were, what we were all about. You know, I wonder what that stack would look like of old photographs and maybe stained journals and, you know, some different things, different documents, financial records that they could bring together. I wonder what kind of conclusions they would draw about who we are and what we were all about. I know one of the things that I had to constantly keep reminding myself of in my research was that in order to understand people and the decisions that they made, you had to understand the time in which they were living. What was the time period? What events did they live through? What did they experience during their day? Because we would act and we would react and do things differently than they would, because we've experienced things that they didn't 100 years ago. And, of course, they experienced things 100 years ago that you and I have not experienced. So our perception of things, our reaction to things would be very different. And so any good researcher remembers that we are a product of whatever time that we live in. And when you're looking at a person's life, you must not separate a person from his or her time. Well, we're going to look at a fellow here in the Bible, a very famous guy. Matter of fact, he's one of those guys that the Jewish people put up on a pedestal. They constantly kept going back to him, and his name was Moses. Moses was God's man during his time period. He was the one that God chose to make a big-time difference. Now, when he received the call, Moses, of course, was very reluctant, and we're going to look at that over the next couple of weeks. He was reluctant. He had a lot of self-doubt. He was filled with fear about some things, but in the end, he yielded to God. And God used him to do some pretty amazing things during his time period. Now, the same is true about today. God is still looking for someone that will believe him, that will trust in him, that will yield their life to him and say, yes, as we talked about this morning, in spite of our weaknesses, in spite of self-doubt, in spite of our fears, and say, you know what? Lord, whatever you want me to do, I'll do it. And whatever you have me to do, I know will be for your glory. You see, we're not in this period of time by accident. God, out of all the time periods that he could have allowed you to be born and you to live, he chose for you to live and be born in this time period. So it's not an accident that we're here today. We were born for a purpose. And that is the title of the message tonight. Born for a purpose. When baby Moses opened his eyes up, he opened them up to a world very much different than our world today. And although his mom and daddy didn't realize it, Moses' birth started a series of events that would change the course of nations. It would shape the destiny of millions of people. And the world would never be the same again. Our first clue is the title of the book that we're looking at right now, Exodus. That is our first clue to let us know that Moses' story is going to be filled with some pretty drastic and great things. That word Exodus there means departure, or it means going out, and that certainly describes what takes place in the second book of the Old Testament. It is about the departure or the going out of the Israelites from Egypt. They've been there now somewhere over 400 years. And they came to that place. Matter of fact, when they came to Egypt, they arrived as one family, but now they are departing as a huge nation. When Pharaoh finally let God's people go, and that's what you read over, let my people go, right? Let my people go. When he finally let God's people go, the Israelites began on what turned out to be, it wasn't intended to be this way. God would have much rather had them to go to point A to point B, but it turned out to be a very long and arduous journey that they took in getting to the land of Canaan. So Exodus is and we follow that journey. Exodus is an exciting book. We go on that journey with them. It is actually a continuation from the book of Genesis into Exodus with a few hundred years in between. So it's a continuation story. If you remember, the main character at the end of Genesis was Joseph, and we spent a lot of time on Sunday evenings talking about the life of Joseph. He lived an incredible life. And we read there how God promoted him out of prison and out of slavery into being the second in command in all of Egypt. And by the way, Egypt at that time was the most powerful nation on the face of this earth. And Joseph was second in command of that. Pharaoh, of course, quickly recognizes Joseph's brilliance. He puts him in charge of Egypt's economy, which turned out to be a pretty smart idea on his part. Because what happens? The famine comes. And Joseph, because he is in charge, he gathers things in, the food in, he gets people prepared for it. Why? Because God told him it was coming and how to prepare for it. And by the way, that was not the case with Jacob and the rest of his sons. They're back in Canaan. If they would have stayed where they were, they would have starved to death. But you remember what happened. They take a couple trips to Egypt, not realizing that the very person they were dealing with in Egypt was their long-lost brother, Joseph. They didn't know it, but Joseph was taking care of them. Joseph was looking out for them. And so finally that is revealed. We talked about that. And then Joseph, after a family reunion, invites his brothers, his dad, the rest of the family to come and live in Egypt so that they could be better taken care of. Now I want you to notice, go back just a couple chapters here in your Bible to Genesis chapter 47. And I want you to notice how Pharaoh responds to the arrival of Jacob and his family. Genesis 47, look at verse 5. Genesis 47, verse 5. And Pharaoh spake unto Joseph, saying, Thy father and thy brethren are come unto thee. The land of Egypt is before thee. In the best, notice that word best there, in the best of the land, make thy father and brethren to dwell. In the land of Goshen, let them dwell. And if thou knowest any men of activity among them, then make them rulers over my cattle. Wow, what an amazing offer, right? By the Pharaoh, the most powerful dude in all the earth at that time. He makes this amazing offer. What does that tell us? It shows us how much the Pharaoh thought of Joseph. Didn't have anything to do with Jacob and the rest of the boys. And the rest. He didn't know them. Up until that time of meeting them there in Egypt, when they finally, he didn't know who they were, but he knew Joseph. And he thought highly of Joseph. He respected him. He wanted what was best for Joseph. And so he does this on behalf of Joseph to his family. Now, even more amazing than that to me is the lack of bitterness in Joseph's heart toward his brothers. I mean, they did some horrible things to him. Look over in Genesis chapter 50, and we'll notice his response. Genesis 50, and look at verse 21. Now, therefore, Joseph is talking here, now, therefore, fear ye not. I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. Again, wow. I mean, that is an amazing promise or appeal that he makes to them. Pharaoh promises some things. Joseph promises some things. Pharaoh kept his promise. Joseph kept his promise to his family. When Joseph's family finally gets there in Egypt, they bring all their stuff on that caravan. You remember Joseph sent wagons back. They brought all their stuff. When you left to sing that wagon train, right? They bring it all back to Egypt. When they get there, the Egyptians did not put these Hebrews in some fenced-off refugee camp. No, this was prime real estate. They gave them the best of the best pieces of property that was available. And they could live there, and they could live in peace, and they could raise their family, and it didn't cost them anything. It was all given to them, and not only was it promised to them at that time, but to future generations. Don't forget that, because that'll bear some light on what we're going to talk about tonight. But it was promised to future generations. All of that worked very well for about 71 years. Joseph was somewhere around 39 years old when his family moved to Egypt. And at 71 years later, the Bible says that he died. Look at the last verse of Exodus chapter 50. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now, when Joseph died, that was the beginning of the end of the good life for the Hebrew people. All of that stuff that they were experiencing up until that time came to an abrupt halt. Life changed dramatically. By this time, the population of the Hebrew people, 71 years have gone by now, population has exploded. I mean, they're having babies right and left. The number is growing. And that caught the attention of the Egyptian people, especially the Egyptian rulers. They started getting a little worried about this number that was growing. You see, Joseph was no longer around to put in a good word for his kinfolk. Up until that time, oh, don't worry about it. They're good people. Oh, they're not going to do you any harm. They're my people. You know me. Joseph is not around anymore to say those things. And so now they began to look with a different attitude toward these foreigners. Matter of fact, their attitude soured toward them. Suspicion began to grow toward the Hebrews. And as you well know, with other times in our world's history, suspicion toward a group of people is only a step away from prejudice. And prejudice is only a step away from persecution. And sadly and tragically, a lot of times, persecution is only a step away from genocide. And that's what we begin to see happen here in the next chapter or two of Exodus. Now, here's the question. Where did that prejudice come from? I mean, it wasn't there before, But now it's suddenly on the scene and things have changed for the Hebrew people. So where does this prejudice come from? I think there were at least two sources for it. And I think one of the sources has to do with something that Joseph warned his brothers about all those years before when they first came to Egypt. Now, it had to do with something very specific in the Egyptian culture. Something that it almost seems like it was a very small thing, an insignificant thing. You know, if you forget about this, no big deal. But it was a big deal. It was a major deal. And I want you to see what that is. Look over in Genesis chapter 46. Genesis chapter 46. And we'll see what Joseph told them. Genesis 46, look down in verse 31. Now this is his instructions to his family, to his brothers specifically. All right, verse 31. And Joseph said unto his brethren and unto his father's house, I will go up and show Pharaoh and say unto him, my brethren and my father's house, which were in the land of Canaan, are coming to me. All right, so I'm going to go ahead of you. I'm going to get them ready. I'm going to prepare the conversation. I'm going to give you an audience with Pharaoh. Look at verse 33. And it shall come to pass when Pharaoh shall call you and shall say, what is your occupation? What's your job? How do you make a living? That's the question he's going to ask you. Joseph knew the Pharaoh, right? Verse 34. That ye shall say, this is how you're supposed to respond, thy servant's trade hath been about cattle. Circle that word cattle. From our youth, even until now, both we and also our fathers, that ye may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians. In other words, Joseph tells his brothers, whatever you do, guys, don't tell Pharaoh that you're shepherds. You tell him that you're dealing in livestock. You keep livestock. Leave it at that. That's enough information. Don't tell him anything else. Now, why would Joseph tell them to do that? Because it tells us right there in the last part of verse 34. Because those who kept the sheep were despised. They were an abomination to the Egyptians. That's highly disliked. That's even hated. Now, added to that was the fact that during this time, again, put yourself in that time period, find out what's going on. The Egyptians at that time were known as being some of the most intelligent people on the face of this earth. Highly educated, highly sophisticated. They had come up with their own system of communication called hieroglyphics. You remember that from school? Not every nation, not every people group had such things. They had their own set of communication symbols, hieroglyphics. Not only that, they had made great advances in the world of science. You see some of that coming out later on when Moses is dealing with the snakes and making the water turn to blood and different things. You see some of that science coming out in that. We'll talk about that. They had made great advances. Their sculptures, their buildings were unrivaled by other nations during that time. So the Egyptians, they took great pride in this. We're somebody. We're educated. We're sophisticated. And when the tourists came in from out of town, from other nations, they didn't mind showing their stuff off. Look how advanced we are. Now, what is that going to do when the tourists from out of town come in Egypt and they see a bunch of lowly, smelly shepherds hanging around claiming to be citizens? It's going to tarnish their image, right? They didn't want them hanging around. They didn't want them tarnishing their image. I mean, there goes the neighborhood, right? Shepherds weren't wanted. Joseph knew what he was doing. He gives them specific instructions. Now, it's obvious Pharaoh was in the cattle business, but the cattle business is different than the sheep business. So when the king asks you what you do for a living, just tell him you handle livestock. Keep it generic, guys. Don't you dare bring it up. So what was their response? Look at chapter 47. They're standing in front of Pharaoh. Pharaoh, yes, he asked them the question that Joseph said he would ask them. Verse 3, and Pharaoh said unto his brethren, what is your occupation? And they said unto Pharaoh, thy servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. Now, folks, either they forgot All right, there's only one of three scenarios here. Either they forgot, or they got so nervous and it just came out, or they just totally ignored the advice from their brother Joseph. Now, I have my opinion of which one of those three really happened. Now, you may have your own opinion, and I'm not going to tell you which one of mine is, but anyway, it's the last one, all right? I think he totally ignored it. I think they're still looking at Joseph, to some degree, as a know-it-all. You remember back when he was having those dreams? You're going to tell us, you're going to rule over us? I think maybe, look, they were still flesh and blood, just like you and me, and they just totally ignored the advice. Whatever reason is true, they told Pharaoh that they were shepherds, and as time passed, that number of shepherds grew. I mean, at first, you got a couple of shepherds hanging around, all right? You go out there to Goshen land, and you see them hanging out. Oh, they're in their space. They're fine. But that number kept growing and growing and growing, and now it's become a problem. We don't like all these shepherds around here. You can hear the prejudice in what I just said, right? I believe there was something else that was even deeper than that caused a major shift in how the Hebrews were viewed. Look in Exodus now, chapter 1. You'll see what it is. Exodus chapter 1, look at verse 8. Very plainly. Now there arose up a new king, Pharaoh, over Egypt. Notice the last words, which knew not Joseph. Joseph, there came a day Joseph passed off from the scenes. We looked at that verse a while ago. There came a day that the Pharaoh who promoted Joseph passed off the scene. There was another Pharaoh that assumed the throne under him. He passed off the scene. And now you have three down now, another Pharaoh in charge. What happens to people when a lot of time passes? People forget. And I can give you one example tonight to totally prove my point from our history. I can go to a certain age group of people and I can say, tell me about the Great Depression that happened in America. And they will sit down. I've sit down with people that have done this and shed tears over what they went through in the Great Depression. Their life today is still affected by what they went through in the Great Depression. They're still hoarding everything. They don't throw away anything. They don't waste anything. And that is such a distance from the generation in which we live in today. Because we live in a generation today that is a disposable generation. We throw away everything. We throw away, look, we pile stuff on our plate at the buffet and we say, no big deal, I don't have room for that. And we don't mind throwing that away at all. We waste at our homes. But you won't catch anybody that went through the Great Depression doing that. Why? Because they remember it. You ask a younger person today, tell me about the Great Depression. Well, I think we studied that in school. Yeah, it happened way back there, and it doesn't affect them. That's what happened in Egypt. There came a generation, these 3 generations later, they didn't remember how bad the famine was. This great famine of 7 years, 7 long years of scraping and fighting for another meal and saying, do we have another cow we can trade in? Do we have some land that we can trade in for food? What kind of service can we give to Pharaoh so that we can eat tomorrow? This generation didn't remember any of that. It was all a distant memory. They didn't remember the great famine. They didn't remember this brilliant guy that Pharaoh elevated out of prison, that took charge of the economy and made it so everybody was prepared and we had enough and we made it through. Man, he was a great guy. What was his name? I think history says his name was Joseph, but I don't remember much about him. They forgot about the agreement that Pharaoh made with Joseph and his family. That was just so far away, that's so far back. It doesn't mean anything today. It was irrelevant to them. And so you have this new Pharaoh on the throne. He doesn't remember any of that. He could care less of what the other pharaohs did before him. And he looks at this group of Hebrews and he sees this growing number and he thinks to himself, Their number is getting bigger every day, and if their number surpasses our number of people, they're going to take over. I could take you back to some moments in American history where people thought the same thing about certain groups of people. If their number gets too big, they're going to take over. That's what happened in Egypt. Look at Exodus chapter 1. Look at verse 9. He decided to do something about it. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. All right, we've got to do something about it. We've got a problem on our hand, and we've got to do something about it. So the living conditions dramatically change here for the Hebrew people. Look at verse 11. Therefore, here's his plan. They did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. Those words remind me of the dark days right before the World War II. You'll remember there were so many Jewish people that their lives were drastically changed almost overnight in Germany because there was a hateful new ruler named Adolf Hitler that came on the scene. And there were many of those Jewish people, masses of them that were murdered. And many of them were crammed into death camps, and they were forced to work as slaves. Many of them worked to death. A lot of similarities. If you compare that time period, that point in Jewish history to this point in Jewish history, you'll find a lot of similarities between the two. Ease, abundance, prosperity, all taken away, just like that. Enter in taskmasters and whips. Now, what is really interesting is that God told Abraham this was going to happen all of those years before. I want to show you that passage of Scripture. Look over in Genesis chapter 15. This was back when God is talking to Abraham. He's making a covenant with him. He's telling him that he's going to take care of him, that he's going to bless him with many, many, as the stars in the heaven. He's going to multiply his seed. He's going to take care of the needs in his people in the coming generations and all those different things. And in the middle of that, God says, chapter 15, verse 13, And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. Where is that? Egypt. It's not their land. And shall serve them. Who is that? The Egyptians. And they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. God told Abraham specific details that this was going to happen. So I know this. This didn't catch God off guard. When this happened, God knew it all along. And this is just God's opportunity to show once again that he keeps his promises. It's like God says, okay, I'm going to tell you it's going to happen. When it happens, I'm going to show up and I'm going to show you what I'm going to do about it. I promise you, I'll take care of you. Look in Exodus chapter 2. You'll see the promise coming about. Exodus chapter 2, look down in verse 23. And it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel signed aside by reason of the bondage. And they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. That's what normal people do, right? Bad things happen. Most of the time, people's attention is turned to God. That's what happened. They turned their attention to him. And God, I love these words, verse 24, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. God is going to keep his promise by sending a deliverer for them. This deliverer was preserved by God. We're going to look at his story in more detail in future weeks. He was preserved by God. He was handpicked by God. He was uniquely prepared by God to not only deal with the Pharaoh, but also the Israelites. God is preparing him, will prepare him for that moment. He was born for a purpose. and his name was Moses. And we're going to spend several weeks talking about Moses. But let me just give you two truths very quickly that boldly stand out to me about the story of the Israelites and Moses. First of all, no matter how difficult things become, they cannot erase God's promises. Now, that may not mean a thing to you tonight, but I promise you, you will face some things in this life down the road that you're going to need to know that. You're going to need to believe that. No matter how difficult things become, how drastic, how terrible, how awful they become, they cannot erase God's promises. The Hebrew people found themselves facing some very difficult things, but God had already promised them, I'm going to send you a deliverer. I'm going to get you out of that mess. When times get hard, it's almost easy sometimes to lead to the conclusion that God has forgotten about his promises. But if there's one thing that the book of Exodus teaches us all the way through, it's when God says something, I promise something, he never forgets it. You may forget, I may forget, the whole nation may forget, but God doesn't ever forget. He keeps his promises. If he made it 1,000 years ago, he doesn't forget that he made it 1,000 years ago. And when it comes time for him to fulfill that promise, he will. He remembers his promises. Number two, second truth. God knows about every bad thing that happens to us. Every single one of them. Look at Exodus chapter 3. Look at what God says to Moses down in verse 7. Exodus chapter 3, verse 7. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people. Every time one of them was struck with a whip, he knew about it. Every time they said a harsh word toward one of them, he knew about it. Every time something was added to their day's labor, he knew about it. He saw the affliction of his people. I love that word, my, don't you? The affliction of my people, which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. Have you ever thought something like this? If God knew what I was going through, he'd do something about it. He can't really know what this is doing to me, because if he did know what this was doing to me, then I know he would show up and do something. Or maybe, if he does know and he's not doing anything, that means he doesn't care about it. Folks, all of those are lies from the devil. All of those are whispers from hell, trying to convince us that God doesn't care about it. God always knows what's happening with us. Every minute detail. And he always cares very deeply for us. As we'll see as we get further into this story, he'll do whatever it takes to rescue his people. God may send plagues on your enemies. God may part the sea for you to cross. God may send manna down from heaven to feed us, but he will take care of us one way or the other, I promise you. God promises us. Now, his deliverance may not arrive when we want it to, when we expect it to, or in the manner that we expect it, but it will always arrive at the best time and at the right time. God takes care of his people, regardless of how big the difficulty may be. It can never overshadow God's concern and care for us. Finally, let me say this. It's no accident, again, that you were born in this particular time, this part of history, in this nation, in this world, facing the things that we're facing. It's not an accident that you're here right now. God is looking today for a man, a woman, a boy, a girl who will surrender their life completely to his will and say, come what may, it doesn't matter. God, I'm going to live for you. I choose to live for your glory. He's looking for some folks like that. You were born for a purpose. And you may feel unqualified, uneducated, untrained, undergifted, or even unworthy. But as we'll see in the coming messages, those are excellent qualifications for God to use to do some amazing things. Would you stand to your feet tonight? I wonder tonight I want to kind of piggyback how we closed this morning's service. But I wonder if we've got some folks here, just in the silence of the next few moments, would say yes to God about some things. Maybe God has been speaking to your heart about some particular thing or saying something to someone or going and doing this or that, maybe taking a role in the church, some responsibility. Maybe it's to witness to this person or that person, but God has been speaking to you in some way. And I wonder tonight, maybe God has spoken to you again, and you would just simply say, yes. God, I realize that I was born in this time for a reason. I'm not here by accident. God, I know you want me to do something to make a difference, not only in this world, but in my circle, my family, my neighborhood, the circle of my friends. I know you want me to make an eternal difference. And God, I'm here tonight to say yes. Whatever it is, I'll do it. I want to be used for your glory. God, use me. God, use me. I wonder if you would pray that prayer even right now. God, give me courage to do what you're asking me to do. Help me not to concentrate on my weaknesses, my flaws. Help me not to listen to the lies of Satan. But Lord, help me to believe on your name. If you could use a man like Moses, you can use me. God, I'm here. Just call me. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that you'd have your way in our heart tonight. Lord, help us to surrender our will to yours. Help us to even look this week for ways that we can serve you better and do things for you. Help us not to be afraid of stepping out for you. As we'll see in the coming weeks, it was a wrestling match for Moses to leave that desert, to believe the voice of the burning bush, to go and do what you were asking him to do. To go to a place that he was hated, go to a place that he would be ridiculed, go to a place that his life would be in danger, to simply do what you were asking him. Lord, give us that same courage. Give us that same boldness. Lord, I pray that you would call us, help us to answer. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. We're going to just